I just wanted to answer questions mainly around the memo that came out from Education yesterday concerning our further efforts to do our best to protect New Brunswick's school children and the folks who are in the education system as staff or volunteers from an emerging global health threat that I think we're all becoming increasingly aware of with every passing day. So clearly the risks from COVID-19 I think are becoming more and more apparent as the virus spreads around the world. And as governments work both internally and with other countries to develop a fair and consistent approach, what we're trying to do here in New Brunswick is make sure that we can protect our most vulnerable. And there'll be other announcements from other departments in the days to come, but I'm here to speak specifically around education. This morning I had the opportunity to participate in a conference call with over 70 other education ministers from around the world, coordinated by UNESCO. It was good to know that despite the difficulties that colleagues are facing in countries like Italy, France, Iran, Afghanistan, and others, that countries ranging from very poor to very wealthy, that we're all looking out for the same basic interests of our students, to make sure that in the event of disruptions, that education can continue, and to make sure that we look for ways to pursue that education even when, as we are going to be talking about here, we have kids who are out of class for hopefully a short period of time. But given the nature of this disease and the way it's spreading, of course, we do have to prepare for the longer term and be happy to answer questions about that. So specifically around the memo that went out yesterday evening, directed through the districts to schools and then out to parents, and also this morning to early childhood education centres. The goal there is to clarify a policy that first came out on Friday and to expand it somewhat given the changed context that we've all seen over the course of the weekend. So the intent with this policy is to make sure that anyone who has traveled internationally is restricted from access to New Brunswick schools for a period of 14 days. Pretty straightforward. In addition to that, because of concerns over the borders with Maine, something that was included as a clarifying note to schools along the Maine New Brunswick border, we are not insisting that people who live in Woodstock, to use a community that's close to my heart, that they don't go across to buy milk in Halton, that they don't go to work in Halton, and vice versa, that we don't eliminate that sort of cross-border cooperation that's long been a hallmark of the relationship between that state and our province. People have asked me very specific questions about, well, how far down can I go? Can I go to Bangor? Can I go to Portsmouth? We're asking people here to act as citizens. The school system isn't here with police or judicial powers. We're here to ask people to act in the best interests of the people who are teaching our kids and our students, the next generation who we're going to rely on to keep this province going. So we're not here to come up with concentric circles away from home that you are or are not allowed to travel. We are saying that if you've traveled internationally, please stay away from school. Use your common sense, use your common judgment, and I think that is going to be enough for nearly every New Brunswicker, and I've been very happy to hear messages of support for this policy from across the province over the last couple of days. Je vais répéter brièvement en français, parce que c'est également important de dire qu'on a, avec le mémo qui était lancé hier, c'était notre effort d'assurer la protection de nos élèves et aussi l'équipe d'enseignants dans les écoles, et aussi les éducateurs et éducatrices dans les centres d'éducation de la petite enfance. Pour moi, la protection de la vie, c'est clair que c'est primordial. Alors, tous nos efforts sont dirigés dans cette direction et c'est pour ça qu'hier soir, on a envoyé une lettre à tous les parents dans la province de dire si tu as pris un voyage au niveau international, tu es interdit d'entrer dans une école pour une période de 2 semaines. Alors, ça applique également que si tu es un parent ou un élève, si tu as voyagé, tu ne peux pas entrer dans les écoles. Alors, ça, c'est notre objectif est encore de protéger les jeunes et aussi les enseignants, enseignantes. Et il y a les comparaisons avec le système qui est annoncé hier en Nouvelle-Écosse pour protéger les foyers de soins. Aussi pour préciser que quelque chose qu'on a besoin absolument de préciser, que pour les gens qui vivent côté de la frontière des États-Unis à Néo-Brunswickois, ce n'est pas une interdiction judiciaire ici. C'est-à-dire, utilise le common sense. Si tu as besoin absolument d'aller au l'État de Maine pour faire le travail, tu peux le faire. Si tu as besoin d'aller pour chercher du lait qui coûte un peu moins cher, est-ce que c'est vraiment nécessaire en comparaison avec le risque qu'il peut présenter pour toi, ton famille, ton communauté, ton province? Alors, c'est ça le message en bref. Je suis absolument heureux de répondre aux questions de tout le monde. Merci.
In the memo, well, that's me. In the memo, you had said it was written essentially March 8th was the cutoff time. So are you essentially saying anybody that arrived home on Saturday, you're okay, but anybody who arrived home on Sunday, you have to take precautions?
I apologize for the confusing wording there, because we said after March 8th, so it's actually March 9th, but correct. Yeah, so and that was the date yesterday on which the decision to extend this policy was made. So it was nothing more than that. And it's one of those problems whenever you're doing anything, introducing a new program or idea, there's a start date, there's a cutoff date. I've been comparing it to if there's a tax increase or decrease that one day before you might get it, one day after you won't. It is arbitrary, and I can appreciate that it causes frustration for folks, but it would be the same if it was 5 days in the future or 2 months in the past. It would still cause the same conflict.
Sorry, this only extends to students, staff, I guess even parents that have a student to the school system?
And volunteers as well, because we have lots of volunteers who come in and help out, but the policy applies to travelers. So if you went and went down south with your kids, it would apply to your whole family. If you went down south and left your kids behind, in addition to your kids being angry with you, you then also wouldn't be able to go into the schools. So it applies to travelers. That's the intent here, whether they're young or old.
Can you just clarify that? So you mean if a parent goes alone and then comes back home, does that student have to stay out of school for 2 weeks?
No, that's exactly it. So it's the parent, it's the traveler who is impacted by the policy. Because the main thing that everyone is doing is trying to move towards, in terms of dealing with this outbreak whenever it hits us here, is dealing with symptoms. That if you exhibit symptoms, self-isolate, if you have a fever and a cough, call 811, and that's the way that, that's the structure that we're going to be using to try and make sure that we can deal with anyone who's concerned about being at risk or starts to exhibit symptoms.
What will be done to kind of make up for students who are out of the classroom for these 2 weeks?
Well, this is one of those areas where, as much as it's difficult, it's a good opportunity for us to make sure that we're ready in the case that this virus causes further disruption, which we've certainly seen in a large number of countries. Again, I was on this call with UNESCO earlier, and there was several 100 million students whose education has been fully interrupted at this point. And we're sharing perspectives on how to address that. And we're going to be working to work with the kids who are currently out of school for the next 2 weeks to try and perfect some of those mechanisms. Some of them are already in place. That we've had experiences in the past where school has been closed for several days because of weather. Students who break their legs. They're fine to work, but they're at home and can't get around for a couple of weeks. The sort of homework assignments that are given either electronically or in paper form by teachers. And those differ from school to school. So one of the things we're trying to use this difficult situation as an opportunity to evaluate exactly how good our structures are for home learning, because it's clear that if we do follow the pattern that we've seen elsewhere, that's probably something we'll need to do more of in the next few months. So we want to make sure that we can do that right. Heard some really interesting ideas around using community television stations, for example, to broadcast lectures, things like that. So we're going to be looking at all avenues to try and make sure that children's education isn't interrupted, because we are seeing school systems talking about interruptions late into this year and into even 2021. So I think we have to be aware of the short-term needs and make sure they're addressed, but also plan for the long term.
Monsieur Carney, combien d'enfants, combien d'élèves sont touchés par cette politique?
Je peux dire que pour la première instance, qui a commencé vendredi avec seulement un petit groupe de pays, c'était juste quelques douzaines d'élèves qui étaient impactés. Pour celui-ci, je vais avoir les chiffres probablement dans quelques minutes, parce que aujourd'hui était la première journée, mais aussi c'était une journée de tempête, une autre grande controverse dans la province. Alors c'est probablement demain avant, parce que je ne suis pas le ministre des vacances, je ne sais pas qui est parti pour quel pays. Alors nous sommes on dépend sur on a besoin de demander aux gens quand ils arrivent dans l'école pour leur demander, OK, est-ce que tu es en vacances, où est-ce que tu es allé, etc.
Puis c'est la seule province, à ma connaissance, qui a adopté une mesure comme la vôtre, alors qu'il n'y a encore aucun cas ici. Est-ce que c'est pas s'attaquer avec une fourmi avec un bazooka en ce moment?
Je pense pas. Je pense que quand on regarde l'impact de cette virus partout dans le monde, l'impact possible, on voit déjà dans les marchés. Mais beaucoup plus important que ça, on voit dans les morts qui arrivent, on voit dans les pays, premier rang comme Italie, avec un système de santé assez fort, qui est maintenant en train de survivre une grande crise. On a besoin de prendre ce temps pour nous préparer pour qu'est-ce qui arrive. chaque journée qu'on n'a pas une infection ici dans la province, c'est une journée qu'on a besoin de bien utiliser pour la préparation. La préparation de nous tous et tous pour qu'est-ce qui va arriver, le changement qu'on va besoin de survivre, le changement au accès à nos institutions publiques. Ça va être un moment qui va assez changer notre province, je suis certain. Mais je suis optimiste que si nous sommes bien préparés, ça peut changer la province dans une manière positive, enfin, qu'après qu'on survive l'expérience du maladie, qu'on va être plus unis, plus forts qu'on était en avant.
What are the repercussions for not following the restriction to come to school, and how realistic is it tracking this kind of situation, given that March break has just happened?
Well, tracking is, there's, if you remember being in school, everyone kind of knows who's gone where and what they've been up to. So there tends to be a level of social trust there, and that's what we're relying on. This, again, is not me standing here as education minister, pretending that I'm wearing a policeman's outfit. The goal here is to call on New Brunswickers and say, look, this is a difficult situation. This is a dangerous disease. You do not want to be the person who brings this virus back to New Brunswick. So please, join with us in taking reasonable precautions to try and protect our students and folks who work in our education system. And that's going to be the core message, is a message of social responsibility. Because if we end up in a situation where we have to depend on government orders and edicts to encourage every piece of good behavior, that would be fairly sad. And one of the reasons why I'm proud to live in a democratic country is that we rely on citizens to carry a lot of the load for difficult choices and difficult decisions. They don't have to be imposed. They don't have to be forced. So this is a directive coming from government. We expect people to comply with it because we live in a country that honors the rule of law.
There are 86 current staff and students and teachers who've been affected by the previous ban, but will this lead to any school closures, do you believe?
Certainly at this point, I don't anticipate that. That's again, though, as answering one of the previous questions, I think we have to start gearing up our responses to make sure that we're ready for that in case it happens. Because the worst thing that could happen is if we sat here now and thought, well, maybe that's going to happen, but didn't plan for it. So folks in my department have been working incredibly hard over the last weeks to prepare contingency plans for whatever eventuality might befall us. And clearly school closures are a possibility. That is absolutely not on the agenda today. And it's in part because it's one of the reasons why we're moving with policies like this to try and delay the need for any more severe measures such as that.
What discussions have you had with Premier Higgs about these restrictions?
Many different discussions over the course of weeks and days, and I've been digging into this subject along with folks in the department for a couple of months now, and have been raising them consistently with him and having good conversations around them, and been very happy to get his support for the initiatives that I've taken to protect our school system.
What about the discrepancy between, what public health is saying and what you're saying? You're saying, you have to stay away from public schools, but they're saying simply self-monitor. So why are you passing on the directives of the health?
Well, it's not really. There are specific responsibilities. Everyone should self-monitor regardless. Everyone in this room. We should all be constantly making sure that we are feeling in good health. And if our fever goes up and we start coughing, we should all be getting out of whatever room we're in, calling 811 and following their instructions. This is not a contradiction with health. This is a policy for the schools under the Education Act, where I have a responsibility to make sure that I do what I can to protect a vulnerable population. And that's the reason why you're going to hearing other announcements from government around protecting other vulnerable populations, because that's our job. It's in coordination with public health and making sure that we don't go against core principles of public health, of course. But again, I've got a job to do, and I'm using my responsibilities in the best way that I can, having consulted broadly with as many experts as I can here nationally and around the world.
There's some criticism from parents about the fact that students may stay home, but they could also go to the mall, or go get some pizza, etc., and that this policy doesn't really extend to that, and it also doesn't help the risk factor. What would you say to that criticism?
The World Health Organization's talked a lot about social distancing and the importance of avoiding large groups of people being together for extended periods of time. And so that's exactly what happens at schools. Schools are, especially with the elementary schools, are often kind of germy places. There's lots of efforts to try and keep them as clean as possible, but they're absolutely a place where large numbers of people get together and are a prime site for infection. That's why you often hear of infections hitting measles, lice, whatever else, are often in schools. So because of school status in that area, and because of the powers I have under the Education Act, that's why this policy is in place. No one has yet made me minister for malls or pizza.
So you're not advising people, like, if they can go, to music class or whatever, like, private piano lessons.
It's again, and that's where the division is important, that public health and the Ministry of Health and other departments in some cases are responsible for other areas of public life and other institutions in our province and for public spaces. I've got responsibility for the schools and early childhood education centres.
For large gatherings in schools, though, like musicals, sports, tournaments, assemblies, are those things going to be postponed? And is that a decision that you guys are going to be making soon?
There's certainly been a lot of conversation about that, and yesterday one of the things in the policy was a prohibition on any international trips by New Brunswick students from now through to the end of the year. So that would be a similar conversation that we'll be having those in the next few days. Already hearing from some schools about them cancelling events, music concerts and so on. Yeah, in many cases, the public are ahead of me on this, that I'm hearing from people who are already taking plans far beyond what I'm talking about in schools and in other areas across the province, because people want to protect themselves. So our goal as the government is to try and make sure that they do so based on accurate information that's going to make their life easier and better rather than harder and more complicated during a period of time that's already going to be difficult for all of us.
And just to clarify, how many students and teachers and people have been impacted by this order to stay home?
Again, I won't have the numbers for that partly because most of the schools in the province are shut because of a storm day today anyway. So usually get those numbers on anything like that towards the end of a day or the following day.
And so are they quarantined, or are they just not allowed to go back to school?
No. This is also, and this is partly one of the only things that makes me glad about having to have these conversations right now is that in advance of the infection arriving, this is the time for all of us to familiarize ourselves with the terms that we're using. Quarantine is when people are put into quarantine, when you can't leave, can't come out of a place. Self-isolation is when you do that voluntarily, and self-monitoring is what we're talking about all of us doing, which is keeping an eye on ourselves and the people around us for symptoms. All that's happening with this policy is a temporary exclusion from school premises, in addition to the public health measures we've already talked about with self-monitoring and so on, leading to self-exclusion if symptoms present.
Minister, I know this is for international travel, but if a student travels to another area within Canada that's obviously been impacted with several cases, why does this restriction not impact them?
So we had a long conversation around that in the department, and you're quite correct around the fact that we have cases in some places in Canada that felt it was inappropriate to impose any restrictions on travel within our own country, and that, again, that the federal government has a role to play here. And I know that Minister Freeland in Ottawa is head of the coordination committee at the federal government level, that they're working to advance their plans, and so we look forward to being part of those.
So is that not something that you would address until it's addressed at the federal level then? Because what's the difference between within our country and another country if there's cases confirmed?
Well, it's the same. The obvious difference is that it's our country, and there's a frontier line there that doesn't exist between us and other nations, that doesn't exist between us and other provinces within Canada. So I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what the federal government's guidance is, and again, my biggest hope on all this is that we can look back at this in a few months and say, my Lord, we spent a lot of time over preparing for something that didn't turn out to be a big deal. But I think we do have to look at the increasing likelihood that it's not going to be that way, and that we're going to be looking at increased restrictions, both coming from the federal government, from this provincial government, from other provincial governments, and from other nations as well. And we'll take inspiration from best practices as we go forward.
And on that note, moving forward, I know there's still uncertainty and who knows what happens tomorrow even, but how long could these measures be in place, and what do you expect the impact will be if it is a long-term period?
Well, I can't speculate on it. I mean, certainly the discussions are that this is going to take some months to resolve, at least. And so certainly when I've been talking to anyone, that's the message that I try and impart, is that, look, we need to be ready for this to be something that affects all of us throughout all of 2020. And certainly when it comes to planning inside the department, that's the time frame that we're looking at, is making sure that for the next school year that we have plans in place so that if we do have difficulties with running the school system in the way we're all used to, that it doesn't have a serious negative impact on our students and their education.
The districts are saying that they're kind of being overwhelmed with questions about this policy and clarifications, and we did receive an email from our parents saying there's a hotline being set up. So are you aware of that hotline, and how can parents follow up and with questions and concerns?
Yeah, we're setting up a hotline in the Department of Education, and I don't have the number yet, and I have a terrible memory for numbers, so I wouldn't even try and remember it if I thought I could. We'll make sure we get that out to everyone as soon as we've got it established. But that's another point again about how we are lucky to be doing this right now prior to the first infection, because imagine if we were dealing with this sort of confusion over any of these sort of areas in the face of an active case in the province where people became concerned not just about whether their child was going to be excluded from a hockey game, but about whether a loved one was going to end up in hospital. So we've got to take advantage of these opportunities to fine-tune all of our government processes, our communications, our use of terminology, to make sure that we're all being as supportive of each other as we can through what's going to be a difficult period.
Minister, I'd just like to switch gears to the budget, if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, that happened today, didn't it? That's what I was doing in there. Yeah.
The $3 million to support teachers with inclusion in the classroom. Can you elaborate on what exactly that is going to go to?
I don't want to get into the work because we've got some really exciting things that we're planning on doing with that, so I prefer to hold off on that for another day's announcement. But basically, the goal there is to, I think we've talked previously about issues around inclusion in our school system, and having an inclusive education, absolutely something we support. And the goal there is to make sure that we address some of the concerns we hear from teachers who say that, I heard this consistently in the Green Paper consultation tour, inclusion is our biggest strength and also our biggest challenge. And so I want to take that biggest challenge, deal with those problems so that we can be fully proud of our inclusive education system in New Brunswick.
And just the I guess, evaluation of different French language program improvements. Can you share any details on like what what those pilots might look like? And I know you mentioned that they'd be in place in some schools in the fall, but
Correct.
I guess what that would look like in that.
So what we're going to do for that one is make sure that when we roll that out, that we've got some people who are actual pedagogical experts helping to design the program, along with the teachers and principals who signed up. And we've been thrilled to have more schools want to be involved in that program than we have the ability to support this year. So that's great. So I think that speaks to the fact that we have an enormous desire in New Brunswick for people to want to learn a second language, and especially our second language, French, if they're Anglophones. And I'm excited to see if this is going to generate the results that I'm optimistic it will. But we'll share all the details as soon as I've got them.
And sorry, just finally, the wage increase is 75 cents per hour for
Yes.
childhood educators. So is that something you're going to be pushing for, I guess, future increases as well with future budgets? Is that something that's still going to be on your radar in the coming year to push for?
I think the Premier, Minister Steves and the Premier both know this is something that I pushed last year, I pushed this year, and I'll push it next year if I still have the honor to have this job.
Just one last question about the memo. For families with students that have traveled abroad, what precautions do they take? I know you mentioned like parents, but assuming like siblings maybe in other schools, I guess what are some of the precautions that you would recommend that whole families take?
The precautions, again, are exactly the same as they are for all of us, which is that if you exhibit any symptoms at all, self-isolate immediately and call Telecare 811. So if you cough, if you have a high fever, self-isolate and call 811. And again, that's a message for everyone from a toddler to a 95-year-old.
Mm-hmm. And with the sibling aspect, I guess, does this ban extend, like if your siblings go to a high school and you're in middle school, does this, ask to stay home apply through for all grades?
It's based on traveler. So if you,
Okay.
if you've got two twins and they happen to, maybe one goes to a French school and one goes to an English school and you're both on the same trip, neither of you go to school.
Okay.
Is that clear? Thank you all very much.
Thank you.